Thank you very much, Marcy, and I'm hopeful that you can hear me sufficiently and see my slides. And if there's a problem, if somebody could please let us know pretty quickly. So by now, the Common Core state standards message about complex text is well known. Unlike previous standards, where the level of text was never stated explicitly, a standard might have said something like sixth graders can identify metaphor and other forms of figurative language in grade level text, but grade level text was never defined. The Common Core is different. Text levels are explicitly described, and a separate standard addresses whether students are increasing their capacity with ever increasingly complex texts over their school careers. Now, prior to spring of 2010, when the standards were released, educators could find few descriptions or advice about complex text. 3 years later, by the spring of 2013, there are books, articles, conference sessions, blogs, and YouTube clips everywhere with all kinds of advice. And when there are lots and lots of suggestions on something as complex text, and complex text is complex by very definition, we can get focused and look at lots and lots of activities without really attending to any one thing. And in this presentation, I'm going to cut to the chase and emphasize the most critical feature of complex text, which is rare words. So here are the rare words in 2 books for middle schoolers. Rare words are the words that occur 9 or fewer times for every million words of text. Both of these texts have in all about 1,900 words, and as these illustrations shows, there are a great many rare words in complex text. So here's the narrative, here's the informational one. Even popular texts like magazines have more sophisticated vocabulary than the conversations between college graduates to one another, as shown in this slide. So what you can see here is that children's books have about 31 rare words for every 1,000 words, and in our conversations, there are only about 17 rare words for every 1,000. And as you see, in magazine articles, even in popular ones, there are a great many rare words. That's because there are lots and lots of names of people and places. Now, there are particular concepts such as the cellular structure of bacteria relative to protists, or the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, that are typically learned through text, not conversations. Yes, we might have a program on bacteria on the Discovery Channel, but even here, the content is presented in an academic manner rather than a conversational one. Further, learning that a particular type of behavior of a character is fatuous, or that someone is acting petulant, that occurs through text, not conversations. Words are the way in which we present concepts, and concepts represent knowledge. And conveying knowledge is what complex texts are all about. Rare vocabulary accounts for only a small percentage of the words in text, typically 10% or less. So here what you see is the distribution of vocabulary in text, and this is something that we often don't talk about, but 4,000 word families account for about 90% of the words in text, and the other 10% are accounted for by a great many words, approximately 300,000. What I'm suggesting here today is it's that 10% that makes a text complex. And even at the primary grades, we have fairly high percentages, like around 6% in primary grades. Whenever a trade book writer writes, they use a lot of rare vocabulary. So words like embryonic, fatuous, diversion, petulant, those words occur up here in that 10%. Now, what's critical to observe about this extended or unique vocabulary is that it's not the same in stories and in informational text. So here are 2 examples. the words that you saw at the beginning come from this narrative text, which is called The Storyteller by Saki. And as you see here, an author uses words to nuance certain ideas. Just because the word is diversion is in a text, you wouldn't expect the word resolute in the same text. That's very different in the informational text. Okay, once you see the word that introduces this text, you actually, it makes sense that words like fertilized, cells, mated, and so on are all part of it. Now, the point that we're trying to make here is that we have a shared vocabulary, but there's a small percentage of words, okay, about 10% of the words in these texts, that make these texts very unique. And the kinds of words in stories and the kinds of words in informational text aren't the same kinds of words. The words in content areas actually occur in conceptual networks. So we talk about the habitat of a spider, for example, or body parts of a spider. These words aren't synonyms for one another. They're words that build a category of ideas. But the words in stories, that extra 10%, those words are very different. Those words fall into particular networks, words about communicating, words about emotions, or words about how people move and act. Okay, so we have differences in this vocabulary, in this 10% of the vocabulary, and these differences are really critical to support our students with if we're going to help them up the staircase of text complexity. Okay, so here's an example of a content area text. Now, it turns out when we go into the content areas, we have very clear indication. For example, the next generation science standards give us ideas about the concepts we need to teach. And what we're seeing here is we, as program developers, so this comes from a program called Seeds of Science, Roots of Reading from the University of California, Berkeley, Lawrence Hall of Science. What you see with the core concepts that scientists have picked, and these concepts aren't going to change radically no matter what the content of new standards are. What we see is that there are words that relate to property, but these words aren't synonyms for the word property. They help, though, to develop the understanding of what a property of a substance is when we're dealing with chemistry. Another aspect of content area vocabulary is that it's cyclical. So in grade 2, we start with some core ideas about magnetism. In grade 4, we embellish, extend, keep building those nodes. So in fact, if you could think of these pink dimensions as nodes, here we're continuing to expand upon them. So you can see that if you miss some of those fundamental ideas in grade 2 or 3, or 4, by grade 6, that's going to be an enormous amount of vocabulary you're going to need to deal with. Now, in our content area vocabulary, specialists in social studies, science, health, mathematics have given us a very good idea about what the critical words are. That's very different when we teach literary text. A good literary writer, if you think about E.B. White, picks certain words very carefully to communicate aspects of their characters or the setting or the plot. So the words on the left of this chart come from a unit in a text, 2 different stories. In one, they used words around amazed, fascinated, marveled. Second, baffled, bewildered, stumped. What I want to underscore here is that the author didn't keep using the word baffled over and over and over again. Okay, if you remember Dick and Jane, they always did things in sets of 3. I think that they had a real obsessive disorder, right? They always ran, or they had fun. A good writer, the quality of literature has to do with the writer's nuancing. There's a precision to it, but it's a different kind of precision than the ways in which informational writers write. Now, to teach this kind of vocabulary is very challenging. Yes, the content area specialist told us exactly what concepts need to be emphasized. And we have a good idea on standards tests in science or social studies what concepts are going to be there for particular grades. That's not the case with literary narrative texts. So let's take these words from the storyteller. So we start with all of the rare words. We eliminate short words, 5 letters or less. We eliminate proper names. We eliminate concrete or imageable words. And finally, we take out inflected endings and simple derivations. We're still left with a lot of words. Now, and look at these words. I mean, how are we going to teach them? If we've been doing the tier approach, we pick about 10% of these words, and we emphasize them over and over again, like the word unsympathetic. Within the tier approach, the words are actually chosen because they're concepts that students already have, like the concept underlying murmuring, mumbling, or whispering, right? Or unsympathetic, being callous or cold, or not caring. What I'm going to suggest is just focusing on that small percentage and not looking at how that word unsympathetic connects to a whole class of words is never going to do the job of getting our students prepared for complex text. Because you know what? The next short story, Thank You Ma'am, in a program has a whole nother set of rare words that are completely different than these. But I don't want you to despair. It turns out that when we do analyses, which are possible now because of these large digitized data banks, we've been looking at what word clusters the words fall into. And as you can see here, the words, all these words, many of them fall into these categories of communication, emotions, and also features, traits of people, and also physical traits of things. And what I'm underscoring is that a powerful generative vocabulary instruction gets kids to think about the categories from which words come, and that that's a part of their speaking, listening, and reading. So let me give you an illustration here. Ways of communicating are a really critical way in which authors tell us something about the characters. So if these children are murmuring, if there's a murmur of dissent, for example, or if a character retorts, that's different than if they said or shrieked or yelled. These are insights into some motivations of characters and also in the way in which they're interacting and solving problems. So one of the things that I'm suggesting is that we actually focus on, just like we had the nodes in science text that I showed you for chemistry, we also have some from this text that have to do with ways of communicating. Now, all these other words like remark, observe, state, repeat, enumerated, and so on, they aren't in this book. But we can start showing students that the author chose very carefully from among lots of words to pick just the right word. And the best place we can help students do that is in their writing. Now, we can expand on this by talking about cognates, idioms, and so on. But what I want to point out, especially with this example here of murmur, comment, recite, commend, so on from the storyteller, is that when students are seeing these words as part of functions of narratives, all narratives have ways in which characters communicate, if there are characters in them. All narratives have context and features of context. And the higher the literary quality, the more embellished that writer will give us an idea of that context or the character, the traits, emotions, and motivations. And I'm suggesting that these are the words. So we're focusing on sets of words. So rather than just one word that would communicate communication, we've actually been teaching a set of 5 words. and talking to the students. This is where close reading comes in. And here's an example of a word in the story where students are needing to use the context of the story to give meaning to that word. And they probably don't know that it has something to do with dissenting. But when they go into that story to look for support words, they can actually get some background for that. I'm hoping we will provide this PowerPoint on our website on Text Project, and I'm also going to send this particular slide to the conference organizers so that you can have a start. I'm saying that communication, emotions, even though Saki in the storyteller, there wasn't a lot of emotion. It was a storyteller telling a story to some kids in a railroad carriage or railway compartment. But these 3 categories and these 5 words for every category can go an awfully long way to capturing this sense of the words and the communities of words and stories, and also can give students a sense of words that occur frequently. So there are a lot of words that connect to each of these key words. I also want to point out that we have something called exceptional expressions for everyday events at Text Project for your free download. Remember, we're not for profit, and we've taken everyday words to help teachers begin working on this strategy and also help students develop a metacognitive stance for understanding that authors pick words in stories carefully. Remember, mathematicians don't use a thesaurus. There's not a synonym for equation or for fraction. Good writers of stories, on the other hand, do nuance the words. That's where the precision of a narrative writer comes in. Okay, so we've got these lessons that we welcome you to use to help teachers begin developing the stance for the kinds of words and stories. I want to point out that we've got lots of resources. We've just added FYI for Kids, which are a set of short magazine articles. We've got some great webinars. Nell Duke is going to be giving one later this month. And lots of free resources. This is the work that we're doing at this point, where we're sharing what we can with teachers. So please, please make use of these resources. And keep remembering, everything that we have here is for free